Now, last time I spoke at one of these meetings, I argued that without the BNP, the Brexit vote wouldn't have been won and Trump wouldn't have won the American presidential election. Now, that sounds at first completely absurd. By the time those votes were taken, the BNP was virtually dead. But what's being overlooked there is that politics is what science calls a complex system. It's like the weather. And small things happening can have very large repercussions in the future. And the small event which happened, which had huge repercussions, was that around 2010, the BBC was so frightened of the votes that the BNP was getting, it decided to plug Farage, somebody who's anathema to the BBC. It decided to make him into a big media figure. He seemed to be never off question time, yeah? Now, if that hadn't happened, and Farage hadn't got all that publicity, and UKIP hadn't become so prominent, the Brexit vote wouldn't have been won, because it was a very narrow thing. Now, Farage himself said that the people around Trump at the time of the American presidential election said that without the protests made by Britons in the Brexit vote, Trump wouldn't have won the election. And I think that this is a very important lesson in politics, that small things people do, which don't seem very important at the time or very influential, can have huge influence in the future. And the same applies to the Brexit vote. The fact it was won, even if May fudges it, and we get a very poor, almost non-existent leaving, the fact that that has taken place is having huge repercussions throughout Europe. Italians thinking about leaving, all kinds of people are beginning to consider maybe we should leave too. So repercussions are very important. Now, this is the last talk I gave. This talk today is about, are we winning or losing? And of course, are we winning or losing the West? Are we losing our societies, our right to any self-government, our right to be heard, our people, our identity and everything else? Are we winning or losing? And every time I wake up in the morning, I'm sure many of you here do, the first thing I do is look at the press and see what's happening with the parties. You know, is UKIP recovering? What's happening in Italy with Beppe Grillo, the AfD? Are we winning or losing via the political parties and the political apparatus within Europe and Britain and America? But actually, that is not the most important barometer that we should be looking at. The really important political barometer is not the state of the parties. It's something quite different. It's whether people believe in the system anymore. That is absolutely fundamental. No system can survive long if people don't believe in it. They can use repression for a while, but eventually it will fall apart for them. And people are now poised to stop believing in the system in the way they have since World War II. Now, so three little quotes, so you know who said these things. The predominant ideology in the world is now nationalism. You know who said that?
Pat Buchanan.
Well, actually, it was George Soros a few weeks ago. Yeah, George Soros, yeah. And so he knows what's going on. Now, the second one is power is where people believe it is. Who said that? Well, it's actually a line from Game of Thrones. And a very shrewd line, because when you're in power, you hang by a very fine thread. The palace guard, the police, the army, all these people can turn overnight. That's what happened to Ceausescu. You're not as powerful as you think you are, and you're poised for downfall at any time, as Roman emperors often found when the palace guard turned against them. So they're not as secure in power, which makes them nervous. They're not as secure as you might think. Now, the third quote is this. The really important things in human affairs are fought at the margins of human endeavour. Who said that? Anyone know? Or was Enoch Powell, actually? So, if things are tight, it doesn't mean you're not winning. It just means that's the nature of the struggle for important things. The big ups and downs, you're up one day, down the next. That went on in the Second World War, of course, on both sides. Now, something people are becoming aware in the last year or two particularly, this has accelerated, that something terrible is being done to their societies in the West. Something terrible is being done. They never really thought of it that way before. They see it in terms of government making mistakes, misunderstandings. Oh, well, they wouldn't really mean to do that. They'll correct it soon. No, they won't. 77% of Belgians recently said they didn't feel at home in their own country anymore because of immigration. This is astonishing to me, how the message has been penetrating since the Brexit vote that something terrible is happening in our societies. Yeah, now, even the press cannot avoid admitting some of these things. For instance, a nice little story. The New York Times about a year ago said that the idea of globalism as a way of subjugating the world is a far-right conspiracy invention. And yet a year later, they denounced globalism, no such thing. And yet recently, when Trump attended Davos, the New York Times said he was something like, he's the fox in the heart of globalism. Mm-hmm. So even then we've begun to admit what was actually going on. Now, what we need, what people need now, people are confused. They know something's seriously wrong, but they can't quite put their finger on their hand. They need a handle, a verbal handle to put their finger on what's going on. Globalism is too complicated. If you talk about globalism, they start thinking about factories in China. Well, yeah, but I mean, that provides my cheap computer. Immigration, well, the government says we need more labour, your ageing population, jobs the British won't do, bring in skills. So they're not really sure about all that. You need some kind of pithy way of looking at things that people can understand. And I think I've got one. This is from a Polish psychologist called Andrzej Lobaczewski, if I'm pronouncing his name right. And it's the concept he came up with was a pathocracy. That's not a democracy, it's a pathological state. Yeah? And what happens, what he said, what the psychologist said, is that societies go through a cycle between good times and bad times. In the good times, the societies are run by reasonably healthy people, and people are complacent. And little by little, the 5% of psychopathic, personality disordered people who are always looking for power creep in, they infest the system and they take it over. And that is really what's happened in the West. We're now in a pathocracy. And he made some very, very interesting points that are so familiar to us living in Britain. Firstly, the good times, bad times. Well, we had the good times after the war, huge growth in prosperity, people very complacent, happy with the political parties, choice of two and all that. And that's one thing. The second thing is about the pathocracy is that they're fanatical and they're against their own people. Because that's the nature of psychopaths, they're destructive. People with personality disorders are destructive. So the system is against their own people. Isn't that familiar here? Isn't the system against us? Well, you can feel it when you go around and you read the press. This system is against us, and it's fanatically against us too. The other thing he said is that the pathocracy sows the seeds of its own destruction. And the reason for that is they don't have much emotional foresight. They do things which to them at the time seem robust and sensible, but they haven't really thought them through. And I think a good example of that is Merkel and the million immigrants just walking in to Germany. I mean, if she'd just kept her head down and carried on with the slow trickle of immigration, yeah, people wouldn't have noticed so much. When you suddenly flood the country with 1 million people, just like that, well, maybe 1.5 million, nobody really knows. This alerts people to what's going on. And people have been alerted all over the West and America. People have been alerted to the fact that something is seriously wrong in our societies. Something terrible is happening to us. The regime naturally notices that people are now discontented and beginning to suspect. Maybe suspect more than be sure. The system feels itself challenged. And what do systems do of this kind when they feel challenged? The people are not quite believing anymore. Well, they've got 3 strings to their bow. The first is the fake democracy of different parties where whichever way you vote, you get the same thing. And in the last year or two, the main parties have drawn together in giving you even less choice. Gradually, over the last few years, they've drawn together so whichever way you vote for, there's even less choice than there were before. Once there were differences between Conservative and Labour. Now the Conservatives are nothing remotely to do with conservatism, and Labour has nothing to do with working class people. There's no difference. They're just all apparatchiks in the same power structure, all fighting for the top job. So that's their first line of defence. It's the multi-party system where however you vote, you get the same thing. The second string to their bow is threats and suppression. Well, they're certainly going in for that, aren't they? God, like the headline a couple of weeks ago, 15 years in prison for looking at a right-wing website. What does that mean, a right-wing website? Nobody knows. It's 15 years in prison. This is designed to frighten people, obviously. The bannings last weekend, very interesting those, the 3 bannings from entering the country. In fact, the bannings achieved exactly the opposite effect of what the government wanted. They wanted these people not to be heard. As a result of it, they've got huge publicity, largely in the alternative media. And Tommy Robinson's interviews with them have already got 150,000, 200,000 listens. Yeah. So it didn't really work, and this is called become known as the Streisand effect, after Barbara Streisand, who tried to stop the press putting in photos of her house. Well, all it did was draw more attention. Everybody wanted to see it. So the bannings of these people are being completely counterproductive. In fact, one of them said you can imprison a person, you can't imprison an idea. So why do they do it when it's not going to work against them? Well, lack of emotional foresight, lack of intuitive emotional understanding of things, but also I think one of the elements in explaining the bannings is the police mindset. Now, I happen to know somebody who's retired from the police, and I asked him about this, and he said, oh, well, the way the police think, it's always, whatever the problem is, you round up the ringleaders. Yeah, this ringleader mentality. Now, that might work with bank robbers. It doesn't really work with politics, because the ideas are spread all around. You can't just... We don't live in a medieval village society where the only way an idea can be spread is by somebody visiting the village and speaking to somebody. If you stop them visiting the village, they can't speak. It doesn't work like that anymore. And these bannings have been completely counterproductive. Although the government, the fact that they undertook these partly reflects the police mindset of round up the ringleaders, and it secondly reflects the fact they're in such a bit of a state of panic. In fact, according to the press, there are actually 900 police from the Met now who are engaged in looking at social media for anyone can stop them saying something the government like. I mean, never mind burglary, they're not interested in that anymore, you know. Burglary, have you noticed they've disappeared? They don't investigate shoplifting anymore, yeah? Police used to be in shops arresting shoplifters. You don't see them anymore. They've just left the shops to their own devices. And then, of course, you have the mass rape in various towns in England, trying to play it down. They're trying to play that down. Yeah, Telford is the latest one. They're trying to play it down. So the threats and suppression, that's their second technique. After the multi-party system, wherever you go, whichever way you vote, you get the same thing. The third string they have is the indoctrination. And my goodness, hasn't there been a deterioration in the press in the last 18 months, 2 years? They make no attempt at being journalistic anymore, which they're hysterical in their wish to step up the indoctrination of the public into don't disagree with the government. You're supposed to believe that what is happening is what would be good, what is good to happen. That two are the same thing. Magical thinking and what is good is dictated to you by the government. They tell you that something's good, and then they tell you to believe that what's being done is what will produce that good. And it's sort of, you're supposed to suspend your own judgment about what's really happening in the world. There's emotional impotentism. And then the daily PC absurdities. Brighton Council is just calling on its staff to wear badges stating their gender. Yeah? I'm not actually sure. I don't want to offend anybody, but I mean, I'm not sure how many genders there are now. I thought there were 2.
At least 5.
Then I thought there were 3. There was transgender. Now there's non-genders, and maybe there are a few more as well.
Non-binary.
Non-binary. As far as I can understand, the people who promote this are actually arguing among themselves. Well, I'm going to come to that in a moment. in fact, Camille Paglia, who writes against feminism, which of course has become completely distorted.
Crazy.
And it's not. It's crazy now. It's nothing to do with female liberation anymore. Camille Paglia said when she studied history, she noticed that when androgyny became popular in societies, it meant they were on the verge of collapse. Yeah, interesting little point now. I don't know how true that is, but that's what she said. Now recently also the judges, the body that advises judges on how to enforce the law, has told them that equality no longer means equality. You read that? They're saying that true equality means that you have to give favour to minorities. So that's the next stage beyond equality. Next thing, your equality means some are more equal than others. It absolutely amazes the judges' own body, apparently, according to the press. Peter Tatchell has said something of the same thing. Now, somebody famously said that the idea behind propaganda is to make it seem impossible to say things. Yeah? It's not to persuade you towards the point of view expressed by the propaganda. They don't expect you to believe it. They just want you to feel you can't say anything else. And that's why this constant imposition of political correctness, particularly in London, to make it seem, my God, if I say a word here, you know, they're all going to be against me, you know, and what good would it do? So you're intimidated from saying anything. You're not required to believe, you're just required to shut up. Now, that works up to a point if people have some fundamental belief in the system, yeah? They'll let a lot go. People will let a lot go and forgive a lot by government if they think the government's basically on their side, which is the point that Peter was making earlier. When they cease to believe that, then it's a different game entirely. Now, there's a very... it's impossible to say what will happen next, but we know that what's happening, what government is doing, is not working anymore in maintaining the bond between government and people. There's a Russian communist joke from the communist era about a woman who goes out and starts handing out pamphlets attacking the system. And she, of course, is arrested, and they take her to the police station, and they look in the booklets to see what she said to attacking the system. And they look through the booklet, there's nothing written in it at all, it's just blank pages. So they say to the woman, well, you're attacking the system, why is there nothing in your pamphlets? And she says, because everybody already knows. And that's the point. You know, they may be trying to shut us up, but the point is we're reaching a point of no return where we don't need to say anything because people already know that there's something seriously wrong here. What will happen next? Well, no one can say that. This is it's like the economy. It's an unknown, a fundamental uncertainty. But what we can say is that belief in the system is breaking down, and once that happens, systems don't continue. In East Germany is a good example of that. It just went fat one day. People didn't believe it anymore. And I should go back. If you take power in a revolutionary situation, the first thing you should do is tell the civil servants, the police and the army, their pensions will be protected. Because then they will go on and serve anybody else. They'll serve anybody just to get their pension. So it's very important to have that continuity. Now, how should we look at this breakdown in belief? Well, Thomas Kuhn called it a paradigm shift. That there's an official view, which everybody accepts, all the authorities accept, and the public accept what the authorities say. This may be in science, it could be in politics, economics, or anything else. There's an official view. And then people find that what they're observing is rather different from what the theory predicts. And this is very uncomfortable for people. If you're part of society, you'd want people feel very uncomfortable being at odds with the system, like being at odds with a room full of people who are politically correct. So people accept an increasing degree of divergence between what they see in front of them and what they understand and what they're told is happening. And then a crunch point comes when suddenly, it tends to happen like an avalanche, suddenly the paradigm collapses and another paradigm begins to emerge. And I think we're reaching towards that point. No one knows that the system simply can't continue as it is at the moment if the belief system goes on collapsing. And I think it will. In fact, Steve Bannon said in Italy a few days ago that the populist movement is now unstoppable. And I think that's true. The populist movement may not take quite the form we want, quite the form in arguing for a particular society that we might want, but but it's certainly in our direction. And my big criticism of the nationalist movement, which in my view is what's caused it to collapse, is making the perfect the enemy of the good. People, I see these people for years come to meetings like this and they say, I can't support that because it's not 100% of what I believe. Well, I'm sorry, you know, you've got to be practical about these things. If it's 70%, at least it's a pathway to something. You might get some more later. Anything's better than nothing when you're about to be destroyed. And that is why this movement collapsed, because it was too hard-nosed and too uncompromising. And now what's happening now is we've been replaced by other movements that are a little more subtle. And they're also, they've been able to attract a lot higher powered people than we could ever do years ago in this movement. In the Telegraph today, in fact, there's an interesting little piece saying that all over Europe, people who, intellectuals, thinkers and so on, are emerging who kept quiet before and who are now coming out and saying Europe is a bad idea, we need the nation state. The nation state is the only real protection, the best support of democracy. And people are saying these things which were only said by outsiders even 5 or 10 years ago. So this movement may have more or less collapsed, but it certainly hasn't been the ideas it represents, or at least some path in that direction. Those certainly haven't collapsed. They're growing all the time, and that's why when I asked the question, are we winning or losing? On my deeper analysis, looking at whether people believe or not, rather than looking at political parties, I would say little by little we're heading towards winning.
Very good.